Today guys, I'm going to show you how to make a huge future bass track like this. This one was requested by Nick, one of my coaching students, so shout out to him. And as always, you can grab this project entirely free down below in the description and follow along with me. With that, let's hop in. In terms of our project, we're at 146 BPM here. Future bass tends to sit from around 145, sometimes all the way up to 160. It's a little bit faster than traditional dubstep, which is more in the 140, 150 range. It just gives it that extra little bit of hyper energy, I find. Of course, we're at 4/4, like pretty much any genre of electronic music. All right, so let's start with the drums. Now in future bass, you want your drums to be both punchy and full. We'll get to the snare in a second. It's a very non-traditional snare, and it's normally actually an octave up from maybe a dubstep snare or a drum and bass snare or another type of bass music snare. Let's look at the kick here. So I got two kick drums. I got this Ikali kick, which sounds like this. What I've done here is I've actually left the warping on, which actually isn't affecting the kick here because it's just a one transient sound, so don't worry too much about that. This is what the original sounds like. Now I've just kind of given it a little bit of EQ to make it less boomy, but also I've shortened the tail here just with Ableton's fades a little bit, just so it doesn't have as much of a tail. I like my kicks boomy, but I also like them to not be so like, you know, taking up so much of the low end. So I did a little pattern like this. So on future bass, you know, you want your kicks to normally hit on the 1. So I got 1 on bar 33, and then your snares to hit on the 3. So I got 1, 2, 3, and then I have my kick on the 1 here. Generally speaking, if you're doing that, you're going to make a successful drum pattern. I like to add in a few extra kicks. Occasionally some put off the 1 like this, put on the metronome. Right, I've added a few reverses and stuff, which I'll get to in a second. I've also added this second transient layer in though. I actually just grabbed it from another sample. This is the original sample. Bit of a punchier kick drum, but I didn't really want the tail. I just wanted it to add a bit of punch because I felt like it didn't cut through the mix. Sounds like this when I bring that in. I'm going to turn off the metronome so you can hear the click. And again, without it. Just adds more smack to it, right? Now, sometimes when you are layering kicks together, depending on the waveform, you may need to look at doing some sort of phase alignment or inversion. I just added a utility to this second layer here because it sounded a bit better with the phase inverted. So if it's off, it sounds like this. Still punchy, but not quite the same with the phase inversion on though. So off, on. Let me just zoom out so it's not so crazy. Right, sounds way better. Just going to turn off the follow there. So I really liked that kick. I did add some glue compression just to control the transients. When you're layering kicks together, it can be good to add some sort of group limiting or clipping. I'm just using soft clipper mode on glue compressor here, just so that the transient doesn't poke through too much. It doesn't change the sound of it too much. If I have it off and have it on, it doesn't sound that different, but in terms of the dynamics, it controls it a lot better, so I don't have to worry about my limiter working too hard on my master. Great, so that's the kick drum. I think that they were both the original pitch there. Let me just pull this down. Yeah, so they're both the original there, and then what I did is I brought in a snare and a clap, right? So 2 layers of drums again. Now this snare already had some tail to the sample. Here's the original. I actually pitched it up 1 semitone just to make it better suited to my track. But I did a bit of, pitched it up, just felt better in the key of my song. And got my extra clap layer in here, which just adds a bit of extra fullness. Sounds like a kind of trappy sort of clap. Got a bit of a brightness to it, which I really liked. And then I ran a couple of these through my drums reverb bus just to add a little bit more of a tail to both. I also wanted both my clap and snare to feel like they were in the same reverb space. And I added a secondary reverb to my snare as well, just to give it even more of a tail. So we've got the reverb here. and then this reverb too, which is also where my bass is going through. Kind of glues the snare tail, sorry, and the bass together. Really cool. And then, so those are the main hits, right? If you get your kicks and your claps and snares all together and sounding good, everything else in your drums kind of falls into place. I brought in some hi-hats. Again, it's just a simple sample. I'm just adding a bit of a high pass to take out some low-end energy of the hat. We don't need it there. And I'm just also taming the air of this sample because it was just a little too bright. You can hear with the EQ off, it just pokes through a little bit too much for me. This was kind of the basis of the drum loop, right? Bit of short drums reverb on that hat as well to give it a bit of space. It's great in future bass to add reverb to drums just to fill them out a bit. Otherwise, they sound a bit too dry and kind of, I guess, predictable. I've added a top loop in here just to fill out the tops. Again, this is just a sample. I'm using it on repitch mode because we're at 146 BPM and this sample was at 152. So I've brought it down on repitch, which is going to kind of change the pitch of the sample. It just sounded really cool when I blended it in on the fader here. Especially with all the other layers. So that's pretty straightforward. No EQ or anything, just a good layer, right? You don't necessarily need to process every sound. We've got some drums here. Now in this case, I'm using actually an Ableton rack here with a few different sounds in it. I really liked the toms. This is like a poisonous kit. I don't know which Ableton pack it's in, but sometimes instead of using drum samples from Splice or something, which most of these drum samples are all from Splice, I just like to pull up some of the default Ableton drums and kind of just make them work, especially when it comes to like additional perks and stuff like that. So I just kind of went into the MIDI editor, added some nice kind of offbeat hats and rides, as well as some tom fills. You can hear I added this 2-step tom fill leading into the drop like this. I also added a ton of reverb on my main reverb send down here. Just without it, it sounds a bit kind of boring. And because it's more of a background, occasional sort of drum rack, I just applied it to all of the samples the same. I didn't really care which ones I applied it to. It just sounded really good and just kind of filled out the drop a bit, to be honest. And you can hear when all these samples come together, it just sounds really awesome. I also, partway through the drop in the 1B section of the drop up here, added this crash in the background, which really helped not only to fill out the drums, but it also kind of paired well with the basses and saw stacks and whatever I had down below. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you how this adds into the drop as well. One key thing I did here is it's like a quarter note, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Every second hat I actually brought down about 3 dB, just so it had a bit of accent on the 1 and 3. So 1, 2, kind of accenting where the kick and snare most of the time are happening. Just felt a bit more like lively, added a bit of reverb on my send there too, and just really filled out the drop. Now, in terms of the actual changes I made throughout the drop, I'll get to them in a second. In terms of mixdown though, I just added a limiter on my drums. I like using Pro L2 on my drums sometimes with the unity gain setting here. This means when we add more limiting, we're not actually getting more loudness because it's turning down the output gain, meaning we're just hearing the limiting effect when we use it on this 1-to-1 setting. And I just wanted to kind of control the transients of my drums here a little bit overall, add a bit of a glued feeling to the overall drum kit without using compression. I just wanted to use a limiter because it just rounds things off quite nicely. And this does it without adding extra loudness to my drums. So really helped kind of unify things. And this, when you limit your drums, it makes your master limiter work a little less hard and makes it easier on the mix, right? And so that sounds really good. And then the next thing would be the bass. So let's chat about that now. So as you probably heard from the intro, this is a very bass-driven future bass song. There's definitely all your traditional saws and leads and stuff like that, making it more melodic than, say, an aggressive dubstep track. But this is definitely bass-driven. I actually kind of let the bass tell me the chord progression and the key of the song, right? So I was just kind of doodling on my keyboard, and I went for this classic 6, 7, 1 sort of chord progression in the bass line. We're in the key of G major here. G minor, not G major. And it's a very classic chord progression. I occasionally add the 3, the major third in there, up here, on certain repeats of the phrase. But that was the bass pattern. Now, I started with this main bass sound here, right? Which is a Serum preset that I designed from scratch. What I'm doing here is kind of just creating a very solid bass sound that I want every other bass layer to fit around. So this is a fairly standard sort of sound. What it is we've got a saw wave. If we just listen to the saw here. That's going through a bit of a filter to soften the very top end. But I also added in an analog BD sine wave down the octave, and that gives it a bit of extra weight. Especially when they join together, right? A very key in this sound, though, is turning the random phase down so that these two oscillators start at the same time. I've aligned the beginning point so that they're starting at the top of the cycle, which basically means, they're going to sound good. If we had this off here, you can see here that the start of the phase is very important in how the sound actually comes across. So that's why I brought it around there. And then I brought a sub in, which is just adding that weight again, another kind of sine down the octave. Why I added this is basically I just wanted, instead of using oscillator B as a normal oscillator, I actually turned it down and then decided to use it as an AM oscillator. And then I wanted this one to just come through normal. So this one actually is turned down on the level here, which is very key. Then I also added in some noise just so it would kind of create a bit of texture. Sounds really nice. Use the MG Low 24, very precise, lovely analog type sounding filter. Without it, just doesn't sound as fat. It really rounds off the top end and creates a really good bass feeling. Adding some drive to really give it some character, a little bit of resonance there, but not much. But really the effects here are creating this sound. A bit of hyper dimension. I didn't want to use the unison on Serum on oscillator A because it just sounds a bit too thick. I wanted this to be a bit more straight down the middle, but I sprinkled in a bit of stereo with this hyper effect. Without it, to me, it just adds that subtle bit of life to the sound, especially going into this tube distortion, which is pretty crucial in the sound, that the tube distortion is really creating the harmonic grittiness we want. Especially that sine and saw going into the together with the noise, it's really just gluing it all together really nicely. Multi-band compression to get that classic OTT type sound. Bit of EQ to roll off some extra high end there as well. And that's pretty much the sound, right? We've got it on mono, so it's a bass sound. I added in a second sub underneath that, which is just a pure sine wave. It's just down the octave, just to really reinforce the sub. I'm not turning it up heaps because there's still some sub from the main bass. I just wanted to reinforce it a little more with a second layer so that it all came up to a good level. And then really, I actually didn't end up using this hollow layer. So when I'm layering in basses, I tend to just grab a bunch of presets from Splice, from my favorite Splice packs, the Virtual Riot ones or the Arcando ones. Or there's a ton of different ones I use. Like here, I'm using just some random ones. Down here, I'm using a Virtual Riot kind of plucky bass. Down here, I'm using one of my own. Oh no, this one's not my own. This is a Skybound Vol 2 from Production Master. Great preset pack for future bass and stuff. And another Virtual Riot one. Again, I'm just really creating textures from combining different presets and layering them in with my own. But sometimes they all don't work. So I actually had this hollow preset, which I actually felt like didn't contribute to the overall stack. So you can see I've turned this off here. And I actually would go ahead here and delete it. So sometimes when you're bringing in sounds to your stack, you may use it originally, but then realize later on it's actually making it worse, basically. So I ended up turning it off, and we could just delete that. All right. Then I got this messy pluck sound and this nice pluck sound. I'll get to this 23 serum in a sec. But this actually is a quarter note, or actually eighth note, should I say. So we got these two sounds, and they kind of layer up together like this. So this is the sound of the second one. This creates like the plucky sort of motion in my bass stack. And together they just really fatten up the whole thing, as well as create a bit of a movement to the bass, which otherwise is just pretty static. But both these layers on their own wouldn't hold up. So this one is good, but not quite fat enough. And this one doesn't really have any clarity to it. So those two together really work well to layer up. You can see on both these, I'm using a very steep high pass filter around 200 Hertz to really clean up some space on it. The reason for that is because you don't want a lot of low end on every single bass layer. Sometimes you actually want the bass layer to only really occupy the mids and highs and really add texture to your bass. So it's very important that you're using high pass filters when you're layering basses. As you can see on a lot of these layers, I'm high passing pretty much always from 150 to 200 Hertz, depending on the sound. Very important. So I added these two other preset layers in. They sound like this. This one's really good at adding that aggression to the whole stack. This one adds like a nice kind of extra just saw feeling. You know, it's a very basic sound. It's also, I think, up the octave. So it's just adding a bit of that extra energy up the octave too. And so basically EQ all of the layers to taste. You know, high pass is probably the biggest move you're going to make on all of these. Sometimes you need to tame the high end with a low pass, and then occasionally you may need to pull out some resonances. You know, particularly 2 to 3K sometimes can get pretty powerful. Also, your low end can get pretty built up, which I'll address in a second on the group level. But yeah, you want to make sure your main bass stays front and center. Your sub also stays front and center, and then everything else is kind of mixed accordingly. And then you're going to get a super saw stack, a bass stack that sounds something, you know, obviously depending on the sounds you're using, like this. Now, we're going to go over the group here, because that's really contributing a lot to the sound too. If I turned off all of these group effects, you'll hear it doesn't sound as good. So once you've got the layers dialed in, it's very important to dial in your group effects on your bass to make them all feel like one cohesive layer. I'm sending a bit of reverb to my bass verb down here, which is a high pass reverb, which just gives it a bit of like character in the mix. Sometimes basses sound too dry in the mix, and that can work in certain genres, but I wanted a huge sound, so I went for a bit of bass reverb. So we're going to go through these plugins one by one here. Firstly, the drums bus plugin I use just to really add a certain character and grit to the overall bass group. I'm only using it on 3.1%, but you can hear without it and with it, it's just night and day. It kind of saturates and softens the top end and really actually pushes everything together. I actually lose a little bit of clarity, which is kind of what I wanted, because I felt like the bass was eating up too much space in the mix. So this actually kind of helped undo some of the EQ work I might have had to do. Very important. OTT, of course, to kind of just, we got a tiny amount here at 16%, so not tons. And this is just really gluing the overall groups of basses together. I always use in Future Bass OTT or multiband dynamics, which is a similar one, which is this multiband compression preset, sorry. This one I sometimes use if I want a more subtle effect, but I would dial up the amount higher. But this time I just wanted to add a bit of group OTT to make sure the basses feel really good together. So distortion into multiband, and then I use a bit of EQ just to control some resonances. It's important that you do the EQ after your OTT. Otherwise, the OTT can kind of undo a lot of the work you're doing with EQ because it's compressing and evening things out. So this gets me a lot of control. I'm actually adding in some sub with a low shelf here, an extra dB. I could have just added a dB here, but I just want to kind of do it on the group level so that all of the sub in any of the layers kind of comes up at the same time. You can see here I'm also taking out nearly 3 dB of 150 Hertz. Now guys, this range here is so important to not get muddy, especially because if we go back to our drums, if you look at a frequency analyzer here, if I solo my drums with this, particularly in the kick drum, there's a ton of information down there. Not so much the snare because we're using a higher pitch snare, right? So it's super important that you're taming this range. In fact, if I turn this number 4 off, listen to how it sounds with it off and then with it on. I might even go a bit crazier on that because I think I could clean it up even more, right? So that's a super important range to really be careful of, especially when you're layering tons of basses together like I am here. And then on these top bands, I'm just doing a tiny bit of taming around the upper mids, which again, for those of you who don't know, the upper mids from like 1 to 4K, you really your ears start to pick up those frequencies super well. And because I'm planning on layering in leads, synths and stuff, I don't want the bass to be super present. I want it to be there, but I don't want it to overpower everything else. So do that. I'm also taming a bit of the high end here just because there's a lot of brightness in certain layers. And this low pass just really allows the bass to feel like it's got its place in the mix rather than feeling like unruly. You'll notice if I turn this off, it actually loses a bit of its fatness and feels a bit too open. So low passing on basses, I've done it at multiple stages, really helps to control things. And then lastly, obviously this is just a little filter effect. I probably could take this out here. This is just sidechain. Now for my sidechain trigger, I'm just using a really short snare sample that it's an AU5 sample, which I probably was going to use, but I've just shortened it right down to the click. So we can get a very short sidechain trigger. I've turned it off on the channel here, so we're not going to have it come through our mix. And I'm using it here on my Ableton compressor. Now, some of you might use LFO tool or Shaper Box or some other tool to do sidechain. I like to just use Ableton's compressor because it's super easy and I can dial it in without worrying. So what I've done here is I've enabled the EQ and I've high passed that sound on the sidechain input to make it even shorter and snappier. I've selected a sidechain as my input from that channel, SC up here, and I'm using a ratio of infinity to 1, which is like maximum volume reduction. It instantly kicks in at an attack of minimum, so 0.01 milliseconds, so we're instantly going to get a sidechain ducking effect, and then it allows me to shape the release to taste here. I've got the threshold at negative infinity as well, so we're basically getting like pure silence ducking if you listen to it, and you see it on the graph here. Now, I think the instantaneous nature of the sample that's triggering the sidechain makes it a really, really instant, like very energetic sounding sidechain. Some of you might like a more subtle, sort of longer sidechain. That's the vibe in certain future-based tracks. I liked where I was here, a more intense but shorter version. Generally speaking, the longer the release tail, the less of a threshold you'll have because it's going to duck for ages. If I go up to 200 milliseconds or something here, you'll see that. That's sort of a nice creative effect, but you can see on those moments where I've added some like extra kind of sidechain hits, which was actually for like a cool creative effect. What ends up happening is that it doesn't ever reach max volume. See those lines there? They never reach the top again, which is actually not what you necessarily want. So I'm going to bring that back down to 50, which is where I had it. And I really liked that. I ended up using this sidechain setting for a lot of my sounds, right? And that's pretty much it for the bass, guys. What I do in my drop, once I've done my drums and bass, depending on what I start with, this is at least in terms of the mix down. Sometimes, I think in this track, I did actually start with the bass anyway, so it just made sense. But I'll mix then the overall group level of my drums to my bass and get them sounding good together. Because if you get your drums and bass sounding good in this style, you can kind of mix everything else to those elements because they create the foundation of energy in your track. So I'm just going to go ahead here and play those. I'll come back to the mix in a second, but at least roughly balance your drums and bass now so they feel good with one another. All right, let's turn to the lead now in the drop, which is obviously the main thing you hear. It's the thing that hooks you in. It's the thing that excites you. Now, this particular melody I actually wrote on my MIDI keyboard. Sometimes I'll draw it in just by, going into the piano roll here and kind of just putting in notes, right? But in this case, I just was kind of, playing on my keyboard. So if I go here. Right. Well, that's what I did there, right? So it was really simple melody. And then I just made a second variation. Once I'd made this one, I just duplicated the clip, went into the second version and just made some quick note changes. The rhythm is actually similar. But I just made this note go down the octave, so it's a bit lower, and then this runs up instead of down. And added that extra C note in there just to really add a bit of energy. For the most part, this melody stays the same pretty much through the entire drop, so that was pretty cool. So in terms of the sound design, I want to show you guys, this is actually just a preset I found on Splice. So I do this to show you that sometimes it's actually just fine to use a preset, at least as a starting point, if not as is. There's no shame in trying to, you don't have to try and be like perfectly original in every sound that you make or whatever. You can see here what's going on is you've got 3 oscillators or 2 oscillators and a noise. You've got this G note on the noise here, which is hugely important in the sound. This is basically a exported one-shot note that's going to be key tracked. So if I play this. Now, the problem is, it's not actually going to come through because the level's down, right? So what oscillator A is doing is actually the FMing from the noise, creating this extra texture in oscillator A and also oscillator B. So if I turn this off, you'll notice the difference in sound. Sounds like kind of a basic synth, but if we FM from this noise, sounds sick. If I actually turn this up, that's the source material we're using to do oscillators A and B's FM noise. Slightly different amounts, a bit of detune on these sounds. One's a square, one's a sine. They're all going through the filter here. Played around with the shape of the envelopes and the levels. Bit of filtering, chorus, reverb, and just some brightening in the EQ there. But it's just a preset I used. I took the preset and simply added some extra of my own EQ, some OTT to control it, just because it didn't have much of that in the original. And I felt like it needed it because it was a very resonant sound. And in future bass, you really want to be controlling every sound as much as possible at the individual level. For example, without it, just sounded a bit too boxy, but with it, it just sounded a bit flatter, right? Which is really cool. Now, lastly, I added some erosion here to just really flesh out the noise of the sound. This is so key, guys, in the sound of this lead. It actually kind of makes the preset my own in a way, right? So if I turn it off, right? So it's so key to like take these sounds and just use them in your own way. And then what I've done is I've actually layered in 2 extra layers. Now, I kept it a lot more simple because in most cases, you probably won't need to use as many layers I did for the bass stack. But what I've done here is brought in an additional layer, which is just more of a solid sort of, actually a bass sound, funnily enough, from an Arcando sample pack. It's cool sometimes to use bass sounds as leads, and that's what I've done here. Again, I'm not actually I don't think I changed much at all in this preset. It's just like kind of a saw with a bit of a triangle wave there, some noise in a sub. So it's a bass sound, you can see probably because it's got that sub in it. Bit of distortion, chorus, hyper, compression to really fill it out. But you can see here, it kind of functions as a nice lead there. I'm just controlling it with a similar but slightly different EQ, just controlling that fundamental frequency to make sure it doesn't poke through as much a bit and taking out all that low end noise. Taming the top end a bit of OTT again, and I'm using the same erosion because I want there to be unity between these two layers. Now, I could have done it on the lead group, but for some reason, I just decided to do it here for whatever reason. I'll get to this automation I have on this layer in a second because it doesn't make sense right now. And then 8 bars into the drop, I do something interesting where I bring in a third layer. And guys, this is a fantastic way to just bring your drops up another level when you're making music because it just reinforces the main element in a really cool way. So if we listen to just the lead as it is for the first half of the drop, and then listen to what happens when this stabby layer comes in. Right, it just gives it that anthemic like underlay, right? It just makes it sound more full. It's actually, normally when people do this, they'd add something up the octave, but I've actually done something different here and added it down the octave, kind of just to do something a little bit different. This layer again is a preset, right? I'm just using presets a lot of the time in this track, again with the OTT and erosion, but it's just like a bass pluck actually, again, up the octave, and it just sounded really good. So I was really happy with that sound. Now I blended these to taste, although a lot of the layers just kind of came together as they were. I didn't really have to actually do much volume changes. Added a bit of reverb to some of these, just to give it a bit of texture. So you can hear. Just helped it to kind of cut through and add a bit of space. This one had tons of reverb already, so I didn't need to. Right, it was just baked into the sound. And so then, again, we go to the group level. It's, in the second half of the drop, all 3 layers are in there pretty consistently. I would probably, if I could have a bit more time, go and change the melody in the second half of the drop. Do a few more, like, melody runs. But you don't necessarily need to. It sounds pretty catchy on its own, so it's going to hold up. Okay, so what we're doing here, we're doing a little bit of group compression, just normal compression, not sidechain, in parallel, right? So it's mostly not the compressed signal, but this is just giving it a foundation level of loudness in the mix. Pretty brutal compression, to be honest. You'll see on the gain reduction meter in a sec. And it just gives it this fullness in the mix. What I'm going to do is actually bring in my bass and drums with the lead and listen to how it sounds with the compressor off and then with the compressor on. Listen particularly to the tail, right? Because all these sounds have a bit of a decay to them, the tail can easily get buried in the mix, and this compressor just makes sure the tail is just a bit more there. And you can really exaggerate it and hear it even more. But I still wanted to retain a bunch of the natural sounds, so that's why it's mostly dry, not wet. OTT at the group level to add a bit of unity as well. Bit of Pro Q3 here, and what I'm doing, this is a very uncommon thing I'll do, but when you're using lead sounds, depending on the sounds you choose, they may have quite a bit of stereo image, right? And so if I go into my master here and turn on, I'm going to turn on a mid-side utility, you'll actually, or even I'll just do it on the lead here, right? I'm going to bring on a utility in Ableton. I'm going to set it to mid-side mode and just bring out the sides. If I turn this EQ off, listen to the sound, right? We're just listening to the stereo information only. You'll notice it sounds kind of weird. We're losing a ton of that side information, of that mid-range information, right? And then when we turn it off, it comes all back in. So what I did here is, knowing that, I actually went and listened to the mid version. To kind of compensate, I wanted the mid version only to kind of come through even more clear to compensate, right? So that sounds just way more clear. I'll play it with it off in the mix context and then on. So let's play it again. It just pushes it a little forward without sacrificing any of the other aspects of the sound. And then I'm using a very similar sidechain setting to the bass here, pretty much the same actually. And then I, of course, blend this to taste. So now with just the bass, lead, and drums, we get a really cool result, right? At this point, that's like 80 to 90% of the track done, is at least the drop. But of course, there's a bunch of other stuff we have to go into, including the chords, effects, and whatever. So let's jump into that. So to emphasize the chord progression in the drop, halfway through in drop 1B here, so that's 16 bars into the drop, I actually introduced this extra chord layer. Again, this is just a preset that I've tweaked. It's a Virtual Riot synth. It's super huge, tons of unison, tons of hyper. Like, it sounds so nice. In fact, if I actually turn off all of my effects here for a second and just show it to you raw, this is what it sounds like. I actually had to unfreeze this because it took up so much CPU, even on my computer, which has like tons of CPU and RAM and huge space. So it's like just a huge beastly preset. Let's listen to it. Sounds so epic, right? You can adjust some of the length of it, which I think I did. I made it super long and open. It's a great preset from a Virtual Riot pack. So I just used this, and then I did the so if we go to the bass lines here, I actually did, I think it's the so I got the 5, and then I'm doing the third of each of the chords up the top here. So when we play the 5th and the 3rd like that, we're having like sort of an open voicing with the bass line. It sounds really kind of unified as a chord. Now, of course, as that is, it didn't sound too good, so I had to add some effects to shape it to the mix a little more, cutting out lows and the low mids because a lot of that's being eaten up by the bass. But obviously, I didn't try and do too much, otherwise you lose a lot of the character of this sound, so you have to really balance that there. I actually added a bit of this fuzz distortion to really add a bit of just character to the sound. I felt it was a bit too simple without it. In fact, I'd probably add a little bit more of this mids back, if I'm honest. That's a bit better there. Pull back some of this top end as well, which I'm doing here. I'm pulling out some of that again, presence range at 1 to 4 kilohertz can really add up on synths like this, and especially with all the basses we've got, I wanted to be really careful there. Same in the high end. It was very bright, so I kind of pulled some of that out. So multiple layers of EQ because the pedal kind of added some extra low end in there and some extra harmonics that I just wanted to control in the top end. I also wanted to give it a little bit more presence back because I felt like this added or took away from it too much and added too much high end. This filter enables on and off. We'll get to that in a second. Same with this utility, but we're just side chaining it again, right? By the way, I don't mind the slight click in my sidechain because you don't really hear that in the mix. I'd rather get like a very instantaneous effect. This same principle applies when you're designing sounds, by the way. If you have a synth that has a very kind of pop at the beginning of the sound, oftentimes once you put that into the mix, it actually needs that pop to kind of pop through, so to speak. And to really hear the effect of the sidechain, you really need a bit of a pop effect. And so I don't mind that popping nowadays. I used to kind of avoid it, but now it's fine. I added some extra reverb to my main reverb send here, and that's pretty much it, guys. It's a simple effect. You know, I'd go up that extra chord in alignment with the bass when it does up here. I love like the delay and reverb on it in the tail kind of bleeding out. It creates like such an epic sort of effect. Blended the volume of this one to taste, and that's really it. There's no layers on this one, just because it's a big enough sound on its own. I didn't feel the need to add extra layers, to be honest. I did add this string in, which is just a pad sound. Again, I don't remember where from on Splice, but I just am EQing it, really. It's just a simple sound. It's 2 octaves. Right, so if we solo this. This is just adding some epic extra energy in the last 8 bars of our track, right? So if I bring this in, the soaring chords in, and all of our bass, lead, and drums, you'll get a good idea of what it all sounds like. There, you're getting that CPU's kicking in now. So we'll go ahead and we'll just freeze that again now that we've gone over it. I do use it in the intro a little bit. I also do adjust the volume of it, which I'll get to in a second. I do a little 2 dB decrease. So we'll freeze that again just to save a bit of space. But yeah, guys, honestly, depending on the track, you know, some future bass tracks will have more chord stacks and less bass layers. Some will have less bass layers and more bass layers and less chord stacks, like this one. So it really is track dependent. You may end up having another 2 or 3 chord layers, and maybe you have more notes in those chords. Like for example, I'm just playing kind of triads here and not as many like 7th chords and stuff like that. Often 7th and 9th chords can be really cool to add in a future bass track, but sometimes it's just nice to keep it super simple. In terms of other stuff in the drop, let's just have a look at my notes here. Yeah, we'll get into the drop now. And basically the drop, like what I did was when I had this kind of default structure of 1B and 1A here, is I started to add a bit of variation in. And so there's multiple little moments in the drop that you'll notice just kind of fill it out. So for starters, let's go to the kick drum. Occasionally I'll add this little reverse kick in here. And that moment in the context of the track, right? Just creates, it's very subtle, but it just creates a little bit of energy. I also do like a little kind of 1, 2, 3 micro build at the end of 1A leading into 1B. Just creates a bit of energy. Also do that on the side chain up there to really emphasize that. You know, I do these little gaps in the hats just to make them feel a little more spacious rather than there constantly being hats going on. It's a huge rookie mistake I see in people's tracks, is this everything going on constantly. It's okay with more background elements, but because the hats are kind of pretty key in the sound of the drums, I didn't want them to constantly be going on. I also am occasionally okay to pull out a snare or a clap. So for example here, like this bass stab, which I paired it with down here, in a second I'll get to that, really just creates this cool moment, right? Because we're pulling the snare out, which would have been there, and you're balancing what people expect with the unexpected, and I think that's really cool. This bass preset is just it's actually a drum and bass preset from the DMB Academy guys. What I've done here though is I've just adjusted some of the macros to suit my track. I don't think I ended up modulating a whole lot on this. It was pretty much just 2 notes up the octave and down the octave, right? So, and I just really fine-tune the timing and the note length. You know, if these were both kind of long, it wouldn't have that urgency to it. Like that second note feels a little more stabby because of this gap at the end here, which is really cool. Blended that to taste. I actually took some of the sub out of it because I wanted the next bass note to really shine. And so sometimes you actually want to take the sub out of a certain bass fill so that when the sub comes back in, it just has some epic energy. And so I did that, blended the volume there to taste. I actually did it outside of my bass group because I didn't necessarily want all the same effects going on the main bass stack to apply to it. So I just kind of had it outside there. I only use it once in the drop as well, which is cool because you don't have to necessarily use every single thing that you do throughout the entire track. That's another huge mistake producers make, is they pull out all of their, they play all their cards too early, And they also like feel the need to do every cool thing they've ever done in the track multiple times to show people it's really cool. Guys, just keep it simple and let the moments speak for themselves. Cool, so that's it. I also incorporated the vocal towards the end of each of the phrases here. We'll get to the vocal in a second when we get to the build. But that kind of created a nice tie-in with what's going on in the intro and build. Sometimes people's drops, they kind of feel like just a completely different world to what's going on in the build. And so bringing the vocals in during the fills there just really helped to unify things. Apart from that, second drop, I'm adding in some effects and stuff like that. You'll notice most of the effects in my track are actually in the intro and build, and there's a good reason for that, which I'll get to in a second. But there's this vocal ambience, which I actually just created, I think, from resampling the vocal I had up here, adding reverb and reversing it, and kind of creating this cool chop. I've added OTT, auto, to kind of control it, auto pan to kind of pan it left and right, and some EQ to shape it to the mix. This really fills out the second half of the drop, especially when this crash cymbal comes in. It really, if you even just listen to these two things together, it sounds really sick. Right, that's going on in the background just creates so much hype and energy. And then also with the string that comes in, I think in the second half. And then the soaring chords. Plus the impact here at the beginning. Right, so this is such a key sound. Again, we're just cutting a lot of lows out because we don't need any low end in this sound. But also kind of dulling it a bit because it was a bit too bright. We wanted to push it into the background. Background effects tend to not have tons and tons of high-end energy, which is why a lot of effects and stuff often get turned down quite a lot in your mix. If your effects are too loud, it's because it means that your mix will just feel kind of too like wishy-washy and your main elements won't cut through. So as we'll get to in a second, a lot of my effects are turned down quite a lot on the faders here. Very important that you get that right. Okay, and that's pretty much it in terms of the drop. You know, there's one cool moment here which I do in the on the bass here, right? And this is a very cool moment where I enable the auto filter and just kind of create this sweep. I also pair this up with this moment where the snare comes out again. So I'll just play this whole section for you here, and you'll hear the chords, but mostly there's the bass line sweep down. Sounds really dope. Now, of course, I don't do it on the lead, so that cuts through in that section. I believe I did do it on the, soaring chords here as well. As you can see, obviously it's frozen now. But yeah, you can hear it's happening here too. And that just creates this epic moment. You want to create these epic moments in your drop so they're just unexpected and surprise the listeners. So that's super cool. Last quick thing is you want to be able to pull out some of these basses when you're doing fills and stuff like that. For example, right before the end of the first 1A section, I pull the basses out for a whole half a bar, right? And it just creates tension leading into the next section of the drop. And I actually mute the last lead note there. Gives the vocal some clarity too, and just creates tension. So silence, muting things, subtractive processes to take things out of the mix, take things out of the arrangement, always powerful for making your drops more interesting, right? And guys, that's pretty much the drop. There's a few reverses and stuff like that. Like there's a reverse into 1B. Again, that just creates a bit of tension along with what's going on here with the kick drum. Bit of an impact there to release that. But let's talk about the build now and the vocal, right? So funnily enough, doing the drop is actually only half the battle when it comes to doing the drop, which kind of is a weird concept. But what I mean by that is the build creates so much context for the drop that without a good build, the drop won't really have the full impact it otherwise could have. So 16 bars before even, we've got the build here, right? And it kind of starts off a bit more melodic and then gets a bit hypey towards here. Let's just listen to that again for now. So there's a lot going on in the build, actually. There's probably a lot more going on than in the drop, because the build is like all these elements kind of contributing this build-in energy to release in the drop, right? So you actually tend to have a lot more stuff kind of all piling on top of each other. So let's start what we're doing here. We're bringing the soaring chords in, which we actually filter down towards the end of the drop to create space for some of the rises and the vocal. So it starts off like this, same pattern as in the drop. As I mentioned, there was like a 2 dB bump, right? So if we look here, we have it 2 dB quieter than we would in the drop, just because we don't want the build to overpower the drop. And I'm actually doing a similar sort of thing on a lot of the elements here so that the drop has more impact, as well as doing some master automation, which I'll get to soon. I also bring the string in partway through too in the build. Strings that are holding down one note like this are amazing for adding tension. And I'm actually doing the, what are we doing here? We're in G, right? So I'm using the 5th note there. The 5th is great for adding tension, as is the 3rd sometimes. That just rings out. Now, we've got a few other things. We've got this ARP, which isn't in the drop actually. And it's nice to have an element in your track that doesn't happen in the drop, that only happens kind of in the builds and stuff. We've got an ARP here again, which is just a preset, I believe, from an Arcando sample pack. Very basic sound. It's just saws, sines, noise, distortion. And there's a nice kind of macro here, which opens up the filter. So if we go to the matrix, there's a filter cutoff on macro 1. And then also envelope 1 is controlling the movement, right? So this just opens it up. We are automating macro 1 at multiple points through the build here. It starts quiet and kind of in the background. Cutting out a lot of the lows here because we didn't need them. There's a lot of other elements already in the mix, so we're just carving out that low end space. We're doing quite an aggressive high pass as well. OTT. So that, you can see, really builds a lot of the energy in the drop, especially when we compare it and add in these other effects down here, right? Now, I've actually panned this 5 left and the string 5 right just to create a little bit of space in the mix, since these two elements did clash quite a bit. Right, so that just sounds really good there. As you can see in the first half of the build, there's not a lot of effects besides this impact and this little sweep here. A lot of the effects are really in the second half of the build, right before the drop, creating that super large amount of tension. We also introduced the vocal here in the drop, which I'll get to in a second, because it kind of needs its own section. But I'm also introducing a high-passed version here, as you can see, of the bass line, particularly this nice pluck layer, which was I think a Virtual Riot preset. I wanted to use a simplified, subdued version of the bass we're going to be having in the drop to tease what is yet to come, but in a much more stripped back way, right? Can you imagine if we added all these layers in the build? It would just eat up all the space, right? Especially with all this other stuff going on. So I wanted one simple layer, turned down a bit, which is why I duplicated it, EQ'd to take all that sub out of it. We don't need it. Also having a filter on there to really, subdue it once the vocal comes in. Again, when a vocal comes in, guys, you want to create a lot of space in the mix, and that's what I'm doing there with a lot of the sounds. So you can hear without this bass, though, the drop just doesn't feel as, the build just doesn't feel as powerful. Like, where's all the energy? So that's a huge layer. I also have this build clap and snare. Again, these are layers I'm only using in these sections. I'm just using a good sample. That's it. Good clap sample, bit of reverb. Nothing there. No processing. A snare doing kind of a nice syncopated feeling in the last 4 bars. Now, if I really wanted to, what I would do here is consolidate these. I'd probably chuck on complex warping, go to the envelopes, and then just play around with the clip transposition to kind of create like a classic sort of build effect. Probably go up an octave, something like this. Right, just kind of create a little bit of tension. You could even go up 2 octaves if you really wanted to go crazy, but I don't think I would do that. Yeah, it sounds a bit too crazy if I do that, so I'm going to just leave it to 1 octave. It's a very subtle effect in this case. But it does thin out the sound. I might even actually leave that in there. Just sounds really cool on its own. You can hear it. Pretty cool. Claps going on. We do bring in the kick drum with some sidechain on every kick hit. We're also doing a volume reduction on the kick here. You could do this on a separate channel, but it just means the kick drum in the drop is going to hit 3 dB louder than the one we're using in the drop here. Right, and so that's the drums. Now we have the clap of just the snare. I don't use the full snare because we actually have an effects clap down here in a Kali one with a bit of EQ to just take out some of the lows and mids. This clap here is so key in the drop sounding so full because it's like that moment of silence right before you have these 2 tom hits. It's just everything else pulls out, as you can see. All the synths, all the basses, all the vocals, all the arps, all the effects even pull out right before the drop. This, guys, is the most important moment of the track, because if you don't have this moment to just highlight one element right before the drop, it's just going to lose all its energy. So if those effects kept going the whole way up, like, you're just not going to get as much of an effect, right? Like that riser going on still just doesn't give it as much of impact. So definitely carve out some space right before your drop, even if it's for half a bar like I have here. And yeah, the drum fill here definitely just makes it that higher level of energy, which is cool. I'm adding a few crashes in here from the drop as well. The crash cymbal, I just extended out to the full length. Just basically, I'm using it as an effect here. I might in reality put it on a different channel because I'm treating it more like an effect, but for whatever reason, I just kind of kept it on the same crash channel. Sometimes I put crashes in my drums, sometimes I put them in effects. And then, guys, we just got a few different rises here, really. We're just layering impacts and rises to really build the energy. So we've got 3 rises and a short riser, right? So we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. And these really all just come in at different times. That's the cool thing, is like this riser starts out, this one kind of comes in the middle, and this one comes in at the end. And they all have different kind of effects. Sounds really sick. And you can see by layering 3 risers together, we're basically creating our own riser, which is sick, right? Putting in an impact as well. Right? That's pretty much it. And I'm also using a reversed version as an impact in the drop. So that's how I created the impact version, is just taking a riser, reversing it, using it as an impact sweep. And guys, that's pretty much the drop. In terms of what I'm doing in terms of the vocal, right? So I took a vocal sample from Splice. This is the original sound.
Yeah, I wanna go out tonight. Don't mind if we never know the time. Yeah.
So you can see it's more of a female sound, but I've kind of made it a bit more male sounding. That's through the formant shifting on the Pro or the Complex Pro warping mode. I'm pitching it 4 semitones down into the key of our song. Also, the original vocals at, it's actually at the same tempo, so that's definitely helpful. I'm also EQing out the lows, adding a lot of brightness so it pops through the mix, adding a bit of fuzz in parallel to really give it a bit of a distorted tone. taming the effect of the distortion with some EQ. Vocoding it in parallel gives it this really interesting texture, right? So without it, I might even go ahead and turn off all these other effects just so we can kind of see them one by one, right? You want to be able to hear what's actually going on. So far, especially without the pedal, right? Bit closer with that pedal. This is just adding like a weird texture to it. I like to transform vocals from Splice as much as I can just to make them sound my own. Otherwise, they're going to sound like everyone else. Slamming it with that multi-band compression preset I showed you earlier. Really pushes it through the mix. Double a ether to give it some width. Just a preset of the phaser flanger right here in Ableton. If we go there, double a ether. I mentioned that in one of my previous videos on Ableton presets. Little Alter Boy is a great plugin. I'm actually dry wetting it with a bit of drive down the octave to create that octave effect. Played around with the formant to get a kind of cool vibe. Don't mind. Sounds sick. A bit of extra EQ for any low-end artifacts that have been added in. Vocal reverb and delay, right? This just gives it a bit of space. Don't mind. Pushes it into the mix, gives it context, sounds really dope. Also, I'm using this stereo effect on my send, which I'll get to in a second towards the end of this build. Yeah, and I just chopped up the vocal. The coolest thing I did with this vocal is like this chop here. Don't mind. This one I put up 5 semitones, so you can see the original's at -4. This one here is at -1, and I've just faded the vocals here, right? So I've kind of just taken the vocal and crossfaded it. So if you pull it in Ableton, you can crossfade like that between 2 parallel samples that have warping enabled. And it just creates this cool extra little moment. It was kind of a happy accident, right? It wasn't intentional, but I just went with it. And I just kind of made my own pattern out of the vocal. So you should do this if you're working with splice vocals because it's going to help you sound a lot more original. Which can be helpful sometimes, but also sometimes it's fine just to use a vocal from Splice as is. I didn't in this case, and that's okay. Okay, so what else are we doing here in the track? Okay, I think that's it for the build, guys, and that's it for the vocal. Of course, I'm just taking those first couple moments of the drop, of the vocal for the end of the drop there, both sections. Great, let's look at the intro now. So intro is really simple. I've just programmed in a quick simplified version of the drop drums. It's a lot more sparse. The kick drum, actually I don't take the transient one. I just take the lower, like the subtler kick. So I don't take that plucky transient because it would be a bit too much. I just put it every 2 bars. Besides this little one at the end here, which has a little bit of a syncopated feel. This just gives it this spacious feeling in the intro. I'll just unsolo that. Right, and then I got just the clap layer, not the snare layer. I'd probably actually add some reverb to this for the intro personally. Something like that. And then I'd automate it down after that. Just to give it a bit of space, right? Play around with the amount there. Sounding good. That's mostly just on the 2 and every 3rd bar, sorry. There's the exception of this one here, which adds a little bit of a flurry, a little syncopation here. Bring in my hats with those little gaps in there. Top loop to flesh out the texture. Sounds good. Just creates a little bit of rhythm in the intro. It sounded a bit empty without the drums. Sometimes you want a drumless intro, and sometimes that works, but for this track, I just felt like it needed something. I have an octaved down version of the strings in the intro too. So I've just taken those 2 notes I had here on the original clip, and I've gone, shift down. Just because I want it to be more subtle in the intro. And that comes up on a volume automation on the utility gain here. Sounds cool. Intro chords are basically the same thing as the soaring chords, but I just take an auto filter with an envelope on it to really make them just a bit more subdued. I also change up the chord progression to go 7, 1, 6, and it's over 8 bars instead of 4 bars. So I've doubled the length of the chord progression, but I've also gone from 6, 7, 1 to 7, 1, 6. So it's kind of almost backwards, not quite backwards, but just wanted to change up the chords in the intro to make it a little different. Sometimes tracks have the same chord progression the whole way throughout, and that's fine too, but I just felt like it was going to be a bit too boring if I did that. A little bit quieter than I have the soaring chords by about 4 dB. A bit of reverb as well, actually about the same amount. And I cut that out partway as it's about to head into the build, which I'll get to in a second. I use that same ARP with a bit of modulation, not quite as much as in the build. This just creates that general feeling overall in the intro. Just opening up and closing in certain moments, and then slowly opens up a bit more towards the end of the intro as this riser comes up, right? A few effects, right? Just a bit of a impact there, bit of an impact here, bit of a sweep here. Just to carry the energy through, you want some sort of effects in your intro, right? And then I introduce the same vocal, but I have it continue through, whereas in the build it mutes. So it's the same 4 bars repeated here, so it's that duplicated, right? And that just creates a bit of tension in the intro.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Drums pull out here with that impact.
Don't mind, yeah, 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 yeah. Don't mind.
Key here is that this filter opens up on the soaring chords, and then by that last note right before the 1, the filter fully opens up, the ARP cuts out, and then the string cuts out, and that just creates this like cool moment here right before the 1 of the build. Sometimes like if everything happens interesting on the 1, everything just kind of, it feels too predictable. So sometimes doing this emphasis on like something before or just after the next section can be a lot more interesting, right?
Yeah, yeah, don't mind, don't mind.
That's pretty much it, guys, for the intro there. So I don't think I missed anything. Yeah, we'll just go now to just the general mix down and final master. Guys, I'm going to be honest, a lot of how you engineer Future Bass in terms of the sound selection, in terms of the layering, is going to impact the mix. So what I mean by that is, you want to pick good sounding samples like kicks, snares, claps, hats from good quality sample packs that probably have limiting and or clipping baked into them. I'm obviously using clipping and limiting throughout my process here, especially when I'm layering stuff just to control it. But the reason you want to start with good quality sounds is because they're just going to be way easier to mix. You can see in a lot of cases, I'm only doing tiny changes. I'm not like doing crazy, narrow cuts and boosts and all that sort of stuff on my samples, because I just like the sound of them based on what I've selected. So you need to get really good at sample selection and preset selection. Then you just need to get really good at both fader balancing, which is super important, EQ, which is probably second most important, and then just like dynamic control. A lot of the mix, guys, is good samples, balanced on the faders, and then little bits of EQ here and there, right? Probably more so with the EQ. Like for example, there's hardly any EQ here on the drums. Most of the EQ work is done in the basses, right? And even in terms of EQ work, most of the time what you're doing is just your high passing sounds, right? A lot of the bass stuff I'm adding in as layers is high passing at the right point with the right type of filter cutoff, with the right type of slope, because each of those cutoffs is going to create a different type of sound, right? So you really want to be making sure that you're high passing certain sounds. You really want to create space for just the kick and the bass, or at least the subwoofer to come through, right? The sub here. So what I will do is actually go ahead onto my master, chuck on a limiter. I'll kind of push it as loud as I can get for that particular style. And in this case, I'm kind of trying to get to like between -6 and -4 LUFS, which is super loud, but it's what Future Bass kind of needs. And I've got a few plugins disabled here just for CPU, but I will turn them on in a second. But for now, just even turn off anything except a limiter on your master. I won't because I've already kind of done the mix and I'll show you in a second. But it will just help you gauge your loudness. Now, if you're limiting your track like I am here and you're seeing too much gain reduction, right? If I unsolo everything. Even this like snare transient here is borderline. I really probably should be doing a slight bit more limiting on my drums bus, but most sounds are sticking under -6 dB, which is good. It's what we want. Another reason I'm probably getting a bit of dynamics weirdness is probably because I'm using these 2 multiband compressors, which can do that, but that's a video for another time, right? So basically, you want to mix into a limiter at this point when you're doing your final mix down. I know people will say you shouldn't, but for this genre, you really need to mix everything into a limiter. It's just so important. And again, I would start with mixing drums and bass. If you can get your drums, and this is in the drop, by the way, if you can get your drums and bass sounding good together, like I'll even just go down here. You can see we're already getting to like -7, -6 just with those two, which is a huge result, which is what you want, right? So very important. And then you kind of want to mix everything else in terms of lead, vocal, chords to that, right? And by this point, I've covered a lot of why I've done the EQ changes I made on each sound, so I'm not going to rehash those for you. You can go back earlier into the video and listen to that. But at this point, we just want to get the drums, lead, bass groups kind of balanced. You know, I'll just kind of go on the fader here and use my arrow keys on my keyboard and just kind of go up by 1 dB increments, right? So for example, and a crucial thing to do here is to actually like probably load in a new track, new audio track, pull in a reference track that you really like. So like go into your folder where your music is, probably, where are my tracks here? So like I'll find like a nice kind of future bass track. Yeah, can't think of where one would be right this second. But yeah, you want to kind of pull in a track that's in the same kind of style of future bass that you're making. Mix it to that. I've actually got a ton of resources on reference track. You can just search on our blog or just like look on the YouTube channel. We've got stuff on reference track usage. But yeah, like you want to mix to that and then just really dial in these 3 elements: drums, leads, maybe chords and bass, maybe vocal if it's a particularly vocal driven track in the drop. And just with those 4 or 5 stems, let's call them, get a really good balance. Now, if you're struggling with just the loudness of those stems, there's probably elements within those groups of instruments you need to go and solve. So go back into the mix, balance your drums, try and get it sounding good as one element, balance your basses, try to get it sounding good as one element, your leads, etc. But you really should be able to, at that point, just balance the faders of those overall instruments and get a really, really good result, especially again when mixing into a limiter. A couple key things to look out for in future bass particularly, goes for melodic dubstep and other genres, is you want your sub after a limiter to kind of hit around just below -6 dB. So if I listen to my track here, the sub of the bass line this is where the bass is hitting, is around -6. And if you can get that sounding good, you can get your kick drum as well hitting kind of between -18 and -12. Sometimes it'll be a bit louder than -12, which is fine too. Mine's kind of -9 here. But basically slightly under probably where the sub is. Generally speaking in this genre, it won't be any louder than the bass. And if you're doing sidechain well, they'll move out of the way of each other really, really nicely. But yeah, you want to make sure that's kind of all hitting in this -6 to -18 range. And then by ear, guys, you just want to mix the rest of the track to the kick and bass, really. Basically, the kick should be kind of the anchor for the whole mix, right? Mix everything to the kick drum, and you'll get a really good result. It takes a bit of time and a bit of practice, but you always, if you do it systematically like this, you'll get a good result. A couple of key things in future bass: use lots of OTT and multiband compression, particularly on your leads and bass groups. Even your vocals and chords and stuff too, you should be using it a little bit. Not so much on your drums. You probably don't need to use it there because you should just be able to limit them or clip them a bit and they sound good. But yeah, mix the drop as loud as you can, and then generally the rest of the track will fall into place. If you need to use like volume automation like I did on my master here, you can just chuck a utility pre all of your master processing. I've just grabbed like a 3 dB downwards movement here right before the drop. That just creates a bit of tension so that your build doesn't feel too loud. Pretty cool. Some people will just have the whole track 3 dB louder except the drop as well, so that sometimes works too. But in terms of mastering stuff, really quickly, I'll mention this stereo bus. So this is something I use in a lot of music. It's this ozone imager, right? It's got this stereoize option at 6 milliseconds on this mode 1 here. And then I'm basically just using a utility so it only affects the side channel. So we're basically just adding extra stereo image in. It's kind of like, imagine we're using like 100% wet on a stereo imager. That's kind of what we're doing. Because unfortunately, you can't do that in the imager plugin itself. And then I'm EQing it so any of the low end of my sounds that I send to this stereo bus is taken out. So if I solo this stereo bus, you'll hear what's being sent to it, mostly drums and vocal, I believe. And it just adds this extra like pizzazz in the stereo image. I absolutely love using this in my mixdowns. Just cuts through the mix really nicely. Thought I'd also just mention my 3 reverbs here. My drums reverb is a very short 750 millisecond reverb, just to add a bit of ambience to the drums mostly. Main verb is for mostly my leads and stuff. However, in this track, I'm using it on a bunch of different sounds. It's a bit of a longer one with a bit of chorusing going on. Sounds very lush and thick. Normally, I'd actually use Valhalla Vintage Verb for this, but I thought I'd use Ableton's reverb to show you for the sake of it, keeping it Ableton stock as much as possible. We have it on those bottom 2 layers of our lead, if you remember, really just creating a bit of tension there, as well as a few drum hits. Then our bass verb is on the bass stack, just to give it a bit of ambience. It has all the lows cut out of it, and it's quite bright, so it sounds really like aggressive and gritty without adding extra low end to the sound. Really, really cool. Sometimes I'll actually chuck in a second EQ here and high pass it just to make sure there's definitely no lows. But using it on a send like this, you can get some really dialed in bass sounds on your bass stack. Great, and that's it for mixing. Mastering, I'm just using 2 sets of the multiband compression preset. I do recommend caution sometimes when doing this kind of stuff because Ableton's multiband dynamics plugin doesn't have what we call phase consistent crossovers. In other words, the lows, mids, and highs will slightly shift in terms of timing, and you may get some weird, not audible artifacts, but your dynamics may change. And that just means your waveform will look slightly different and might make your limiter work a little bit harder. However, like it's always worth prioritizing the sound of the mix over like super crazy technical details. So I'm just using a couple in parallel here just to provide 2 kind of layers of just general control. You'll see without these, it kind of does change the sound of the mix quite a bit. It just doesn't feel as full. Sounds really good. Again, just about 20% on each, and that's pretty much it. I'm using Soothe 2 here. I actually had it off for most of the time because it just adds a bit of CPU. Just removes some of the resonances, particularly in the mids. Sometimes it just gets a little bit too crazy, as well as in that 3 to 4 kilohertz range, which can sound really like present and just a bit gnarly. So I've just tamed it there a bit, just a tiny bit, right? Hardly at all. tames it a lot, which I like. That's the stuff you heard there that's being removed. Bit of channel EQ just to take a tiny bit of the top end off. It was just a bit too bright, but like 0.2 dB is tiny, right? That's hardly worth doing it. And then most of the sound of the limiter, of the master, is coming from the limiter. Like in most genres, as you've probably seen if you've watched my builds before, Pro L2 on transparent mode is pretty much my go-to in any genre of electronic dance music. It just sounds great. You hardly hear it working, and you can get really good amounts of loudness. Now, the only difference is in future bass and certain levels of loudness, you're trying to achieve. Sometimes limiting isn't enough. Even if you crank it up as loud as you possibly can, it's just only going to get so loud. And as you saw, we were already cranking a lot of that into the limiter before. So I probably don't want to actually do a lot more. So I'm actually doing something a little riskier. I'm using this G-Clip plugin, which is a free clipper. I have oversample enabled, so we're not going to get any sort of weird artifacts because we're using it in mastering. And I'm actually adding an extra 0.6 dB of gain. And this is actually going to push our loudness over the edge a little bit. We are going to go into distortion territory a little bit here. So you have to be really careful how much you use depending on the sound of the track. But we just get an extra little bit of loudness, which I really like. So let's play that here. You can see if I crank this too much though, particularly the low end starts to distort. So you really want to balance this gain amount. I was getting about -5 before with my clipper, which is a really good amount for future bass. So I probably wouldn't go too much more than that. And guys, that is pretty much it. Again, let's listen to the final result now. Well, from beginning to end, I'm going to delete a bunch of these things and just collapse these. I really hope you enjoyed this build. I really hope you learned a lot, and I learned a lot about how to make good quality, professional, standard future bass. Of course, you'd want to go ahead here and kind of structure your track and add a bit of a second breakdown and second drop. But let's listen to what we got. And that is it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this future bass build. Again, you can grab this project down below and dissect it. Look at how it was made in your own time. And with that in mind, guys, if you ever want me to show you how to make future bass or any genre of music exactly to how you would like it, ask me about my coaching program, the Producer Launchpad. I'll leave a link in the description to sign up for the waitlist for that. We are opening it publicly in January. I'd love to help you make the music you want to make, bring it to a professional standard so you feel confident to be able to go ahead and release that music and build your artist project. Thanks, guys, and as always, happy producing.